now.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good. All right. Well, in our study of First John, we have already learned about, even before we got to chapter 4, we learned about a group of people that John is obviously not happy with. What does he call them? What does he call these people?
Antichrist.
The Antichrist, right? When you get called the Antichrist, you know the person calling you that is not very happy. And so we read about these people in chapter 2, and let's look back at that for just a second. Section starts in verse 8, chapter 2. What do we learn about them? What do we find out about them there in chapter 2 in that paragraph that begins with verse 18? Who are these people? Yeah, you may have to unmute if you're going to comment. So who are these people?
It seems like his biggest concern is that they have disassociated themselves from fellowship.
Yeah. Yeah. So we find out that before that happened, they were part of the group that the author that John is writing to. We don't know, we really don't know as much as we'd like to about this. Does this involve one church or multiple churches? But it's in the geographical area where the author is located. And he says they went out from us. And so they were part of the group before this. And that's something important to keep in mind. These are not people coming in from the outside. They were part of the group. And we also find out that they deny something that is critically important according to John. What do they deny? I'm thinking about verse 22.
The Father and the Son.
Yeah, they deny the Father and the Son, but it seems like they do this by in some way denying the Son. Because he goes on to say anybody who doesn't have the Son doesn't have the Father. And how do they deny the Son? What is the denial that they make according to verse 22?
Denies Jesus as Christ.
Yeah, they deny that Jesus is the Christ. Now that's a really interesting one, because you wonder how in the world they could have previously been a part of the fellowship and denied that Jesus is the Christ. So let's leave that hanging there just for a second. And then let's go on to our chapter today, chapter 4. And he starts talking about these people in the beginning of chapter 4. And what else do we find out that they deny?
And Jesus has come in the flesh.
Yeah, verse 2, that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. And then it's interesting, look in the next verse. He says, they apparently do not confess Jesus. So keep that one in mind as well. And then let's go on down to the beginning of chapter 5, because he resumes talking about these people, at least indirectly, in the first part of chapter 5. So he insists that anybody who's born of God will make a certain confession. And in verses 1 through 5, that confession is put in two slightly different ways. Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Jesus is the Christ.
right? That's one of them. Jesus is the Christ.
Keep the commandments.
Okay, that's also crucial. And what about the denial in verse 5?
Son of God.
Yeah, Jesus is the Son of God. So to deny Jesus is the Christ apparently is synonymous with denying that Jesus is the Son of God. And then if you skip down to verse 6 of chapter 5, by implication, there's something else they deny. Can you, let's have somebody read the first part of verse 6. Somebody read that for us.
This is the one who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ, not with the water only, but with the water and the blood.
All right. Yeah, thank you, John. That sounds like a denial that Jesus came by blood. I mean, he's very emphatic about it. He didn't just come by water, but he came by water and blood. So when all these things are put together, I'll tell you what most scholars think about it, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but most scholars think that these people somehow have made a sharp division between the man Jesus and the Christ, presumably a divine being. And that might help to explain why he can say that they deny that Jesus is the Christ. Jesus is the Son of God. Because if they see the man Jesus as somewhat separate from the divine or the heavenly Christ or Son of God, then you can see why the author insists that the confession has to be Jesus is the Christ, and that you have to confess Jesus. And apparently, based on that last passage we looked at, they deny that Jesus' death, presumably that's what is meant by Jesus coming by blood. They deny that Jesus' death has anything to do with salvation, with our salvation. So it looks like that what is motivating their denials and their ideas about Jesus is this notion that the divine cannot really enter into a real union with the physical, with the material, so that there is only a sort of loose connection between the man Jesus and the divine Christ, which I don't know how we could say it, maybe indwells him, inhabits him temporarily. So I thought that it might be interesting to look at a couple of other early Christian heresies that sound somewhat similar to this. And the first one is one that's revealed to us by Saint Ignatius, who was the bishop of Antioch right after the beginning of the 2nd century. So this is really close probably to the writing of the letters of John. Most people date the letters of John very late in the 1st century. And so Ignatius is like the first, within the first decade of the 2nd century, so very close in time. And Ignatius, as you may know, was arrested and sent to Rome for execution. And on the way, he wrote several letters. And in those letters, he tells us about a group of Christians. I'm not sure he would call them Christians, but I'll use that term in a non-judgmental way. He talks about some Christians who denied that Jesus Christ was really had a physical body. And so it only appeared that he had a physical material body. It only appeared that he suffered and died on the cross. And so again, there seems to be this notion, the notion that seems to be behind this is that the physical or the material and the spiritual cannot really enter into a union. This particular teaching is called docetism or docetism. That comes from the Greek word which means for something to seem like something else. And so this was the notion that Jesus seemed to be a human. He seemed to have a physical body, but in reality, he did not. I guess it was an idea sort of like, you know, the people that show up to Abraham, the three visitors that show up to Abraham, and they appear to be real human beings, but in reality, Abraham finds out later on that they weren't. Then another teaching that we find out about comes from Saint Irenaeus, who wrote late in the 2nd century, and he knows some traditions about an opponent of John in Ephesus, and this opponent's name was Cerinthus. And Cerinthus, according to Irenaeus, taught that at Jesus's baptism, the heavenly divine Christ came down and joined with the human man Jesus temporarily at his baptism. So that's what happened at the baptism of Jesus. And then, so it's like, you know, in the Gospels, what descends upon Jesus at his baptism?
Dove.
Right. The Holy Spirit, right? Spirit comes down on Jesus. Well, according to Cerinthus, that Spirit that came down on Jesus was the Christ, the divine Christ. And then what happens before the crucifixion? The divine Christ leaves, and so is not involved at all in the suffering or crucifixion, and therefore the crucifixion of Jesus doesn't really have anything to do with our salvation. So this notion that is attributed to Cerinthus, I don't know, to me it sounds similar perhaps to the idea that these people had, these antichrists had, according to the letters of John. Any of y'all like to ask anything or comment on that?
Barry, let me add a couple of comments. One, there's a third interesting indication of this, at least the adoption idea that you were mentioning with Irenaeus. In the Gospel of Peter, which is a spurious gospel, when Jesus is on the cross, instead of saying, "It is finished," or "My God, why have you forsaken me?" he cries out, my power has left me, which seems to be very similar to what Irenaeus is talking about, that the Christ left him at that point before he actually dies.
Right.
So, and the Gospel of Peter, well, it depends on who you talk to, but John Dominic Crossan thinks Gospel of Peter is super early. I kind of doubt that, but it's relatively early. It's probably by the end of the 1st century. The other thing is that both the Gospels of Luke and John rather specifically draw attention to Jesus' physicality after he's raised from the dead. And it's oftentimes been suggested that both John and Luke are actually engaging in, even at that point, in an anti-docetic discussion. That is, that they're wanting to make, he says, I think it's in Luke, I'm not a ghost, I'm not a phantom. See my flesh and my bones. A phantom doesn't have flesh and bones. Right. And so it's this kind of emphasis on the kind of unity, physicality is oftentimes seen as anti-docetic.
Yeah, that's good, Mark. I'm glad you mentioned that. Anybody else have a question or comment at this point?
You know, Barry, in reading this through this morning, it all of a sudden struck me that I'm not sure if what I have in my mind as to what Christ means is the same thing that perhaps John had. That word seems to have meaning, and I assume that probably the writer of the letter of John has an idea as to what exactly that means,
What word?
Christ, but he doesn't define that I can see. And I just wonder, is it, what does he mean when he uses the word Christ? What does he mean? And do we think of it differently than what John, the writer of John, meant? Is that that seems to be a very important term, but the definition I'm not sure is given in the letter.
Yeah, I don't think the definition is given in the letter. And I suppose it's hard to know exactly what any given Christian would think about the meaning of that. Of course, in the Gospel of John, it's pretty obvious that it means the Messiah. That is the figure hoped for and expected, by the Jewish people to bring deliverance to them. But I wouldn't be surprised if according to the letters of John, that especially these antichrists see Christ as a more or less a synonym for the term Son of God, and that they think both terms refer to the divine being or the divine principle that came down and sort of loosely was temporarily indwelled Jesus. I don't know, it's hard to know how much they would have connected the term with the notion of Jewish messiahship. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Does that help at all, John, or just muddy the water?
Well, it leads me perhaps in a different direction. It may well be that many of the terms we use are difficult of precise definition. Even the terms father, mother, husband, wife are very difficult for an individual to give an exact definition, in part because when you use the term father in a general sense, my thoughts go to my father,
Right.
very specific person.
Right.
Those words have the capability of having many levels of understanding, and levels that really aren't so much understanding as they are relational, and you can't always define relationships very easily. It's they're, in some ways they're open-ended, and I wonder if Christ isn't that same sort of open-ended, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have content. I don't know, I may be blathering, but
No, you're not. I think I know what you're saying, and I think I think the term probably gets defined a lot differently by different Christians and Christians at different times. But yeah, in First John, it seems like for at least for the opponents of John, this is seems to be a synonym for Son of God, and perhaps refers to the divine person as opposed to the human Jesus. Let's talk just for a minute about how this way of thinking, the kind of thinking that underlies this. Let's talk about that for a minute. Most of you are familiar at least a little bit with Plato and what he thought about things. And of course, he had tremendous influence in the Greco-Roman world. But as you at this world, we look and see and experience.
Oh, Barry, you've
We
gone
lost your
quiet. We can see your mouth move, but it's sort of a docetic thing.
Can you hear me now?
He's become
Yes.
spirit and not flesh.
Okay. All right, we'll try this again. As you know, Plato believed that this world, the physical material universe that we live in, was a frail and very imperfect copy of the true reality, the true world. Was an internal world of the divine ideas or the divine forms. So Plato did not exactly teach that this world was evil, but it's not a big step to go from what Plato taught to conclude that matter and the physical world is evil, and then to conclude that this physical world that we live in was created not by the good God, but by an evil creator, or sometimes he was called the demiurge. And so it's not a huge step to go from Plato's thought to the notion, to a very sharp dichotomy between the physical world, the material world on one hand, and the world of the divine or the spiritual world on the other hand. And of course, that believe that salvation consisted of, first of all, acquiring true knowledge about yourself, and then the true knowledge about the fact that the real world is not this world. And some of you may have seen the movie The Matrix. It's kind of like that. And so the goal of salvation then is to come to understand who you truly are and what's going on, and then eventually, at least, by gaining knowledge of ourselves and knowledge of God, to escape from this evil material world into the divine world. And so I know probably not a whole lot of people hold that idea. And certainly among Christians, I would hope not too many Christians hold that idea exactly. But I still think that there is in a lot of people's thinking, there is a certain dichotomy between the physical material world and that which is spiritual. And I think it has implications for the way we think about things. And that's what I want to spend the rest of our time doing, is talking about how does this dichotomy between the spiritual and the physical, or the spiritual and the material, how does it continue to affect us and sometimes distort our thinking and our action? So what do you think?
Harry, I've always been struck by the standard conception that when people die, Christians die, they're going to go and float on the clouds and kind of be in this kind of heaven, which is not physical. It's kind of spirit, isn't it?
Yes.
Which is really not a Christian idea. I mean, the Christian idea is that we're actually going to have, if you read 1 Corinthians and 1 Thessalonians, and we're going to have bodies, right? We're going to be in flesh, and even Revelation. But we've kind of caught that same Platonic Gnostic idea that somehow we're going to be separated from our bodies and float. So you see cartoons of up in heaven on the clouds, and it kind of fits that same kind of idea that somehow we're freed from physicality.
Yeah, it's probably heard that joke about the preacher who's preaching the funeral, and he looks down at the casket and he says, "This is only the shell. The nut has gone." So yeah, and so what does yeah, that kind of thinking leads to a very different sort of notion of, you know, our human destiny. If our human destiny is to become immaterial spirits. When I was young, I tried to imagine how we would communicate with each other in heaven. And the only thing I could come up with was it would be like talking to some other people on the phone. You know, you wouldn't see them. Somehow you'd be able to, of course, that involves sound. So, but uh, that was not very a very appealing notion of heaven to me. So it does distort the way we think about our bodies and the way we think about our future, and it also it affects the way we think about this world. So what kind of effect does that have?
Barry, I
Yeah.
was going to say that, and it's tied into what you're saying right now, that this is tied very closely to our view of what salvation is.
Yeah.
We have defined salvation in very narrow terms, very individualized terms, but also very narrow spiritualized terms. Whereas throughout the New Testament, salvation is such a broad concept that it can include healing of the body, and ultimately in the images that we get are recreation, so that a new heavens and a new earth includes an earth, that creation itself is a part of that. And if creation itself has an ultimate function in this time of recreation, that should then refocus how we think about creation in the present.
Absolutely. I mean, if, you know, it's a sort of a question of whether, you know, God has created this world and then one day he's just going to trash it, or whether God one day is going to take this world and glorify it and marry it to what we call heaven. Mary, how much more time do we have? Oh, I can't hear you.
I have not gotten the 10-minute warning yet, though it's probably coming fairly soon, but.
Okay, good. Okay, excellent. So, yeah, I was going to talk about this a little bit, but I didn't think we probably.
10-minute warning just showed up, Barry. Good time.
All right. So I want to give anybody else a chance to talk about how this dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual affects and distorts. What about in the area, I don't think this is real common, but sometimes I think it does make itself felt in morality, in the realm of ethics. Can you think of any examples of that?
Seems like that went two different directions. Went in the Stoic direction of trying to harness the physical so that the spiritual could do what it's supposed to do, or the Epicurean direction, which said do whatever your body wants to do. It has nothing to do with your spirit anyhow.
Yeah. Yeah, so, you know, gluttony and you know, sexual promiscuity, you know, they have to do with the body. You know, what's the big deal? That really doesn't affect my spirit. In 1 Corinthians, I don't know if this lies behind the thing that happened that we read about in 1 Corinthians, Bruce. You probably have a better idea of that than I do. But the guy who apparently, you know, apparently there was one or more men at Corinth that believed that going to see the prostitute was okay. And that was justified. Interestingly enough, that was justified on the basis of what? You remember the analogy?
It seems like this spirit and flesh again. The flesh has nothing to do with the spirit and vice versa.
Yeah, I think so. And then the other activity that gets drawn into this is eating, right? Food for the body, body for food. So then you can make the the food is like amoral. It's just meeting one of your bodily functions. So sometimes it has an effect on even on how Christians think about certain moral actions and so on. What about another area I thought about was church architecture. How does it affect that?
I mean,
you
if
think
you
it-
don't think if you don't think that the physical world is that important, then
Yeah.
you're not, you may be very minimalist in what you think. And if and I mean, some of the great church architecture of the world is sort of to, recreate heaven in some way, or, give us an image of heaven and things like that too.
So
The cathedrals, don't they call your direction upwards? It's almost as though what's at ground level is not nearly as important as lifting your eyes up heavenward, it seems. Or you can have many congregations prefer to have the focus on the congregation, and the architecture really doesn't much matter. You can be in a warehouse, for instance,
Right.
that doesn't direct your sight anywhere, but the focus is on the congregation. But your eyes are not taken anywhere else but the congregation.
yeah. So, when churches get ready to, build a sanctuary, what kind of sanctuary do you build? Do you put up a metal all-purpose building, or do you try to do something where the building is adorned with beauty, physical beauty? So, I mean, that's not the only consideration, of course. When churches get ready to build sanctuaries, I understand that. And, people have to do the best they can do. But I think that in some ways it does affect that area as well. Can you think of any other areas that it affects?
The dichotomy seems to be the most prominent when somebody basically gives up their life to save somebody else's life.
Uh-huh.
You have a juncture of the physical and the spiritual. Why does somebody sacrifice their life to save somebody else? If there's not a union of the spiritual and the physical, why are we often compelled to think of doing that?
Yeah.
And I think the death of Jesus really focused that for his followers.
Right.
Why? How does this work? But it's a central issue, it seems to me, in the New Testament.
Yeah, I agree. To the degree that we read the Bible and soak up, what it says, I think that's really the best antidote to this dichotomy. The story of creation, God creates this physical world and then pronounces it very good. This was, just foundational for Christian understanding all throughout, that the physical world is not to be devalued or considered to be evil, and obviously there could mean no such thing as the incarnation of the Son of God in the person of Jesus Christ if there is a radical dichotomy between the spiritual and the physical. I wonder sometimes if this also doesn't affect, I've heard it applied to the doctrine of baptism, that a physical act can only be symbolic. It can't, there can't really be a spiritual result, maybe I should say, of of baptism, because it is, after all, a physical act. And of course, in the Stone Campbell movement, we have said otherwise. We have said that that it is directly connected to the forgiveness of our sins and the reception of the Holy Spirit. So there's another area, I think, where sometimes in people's thinking about a particular doctrine like that, that dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual enters in. Sometimes when in the past, when I've taught the book of Acts and we get to chapter 19, and there's a passage there that talks about Paul taking handkerchiefs and such that he had possessed or had touched or whatever, and those are sent out to people who are sick or demon possessed in other places, and they're cured by that means. And I think probably if that story were not in the Bible, a lot of our folk would think that that was some kind of crazy superstitious, thing. But there you have it. I mean, you can say what you want to about it, but obviously Luke believed that physical objects could carry spiritual power. So, that's why it's never seemed to be a problem to me that that baptism could be connected with the forgiveness of sins and so on. All right, my trusty assistant tells me that there's 1 minute left, and so does anybody have anything to say by way of summary or a very short question?
Barry, thank you very much. I'm assuming that you'll bring it all together next week, so we'll know everything that.
Well, here's what I'm planning on doing, if it's okay with y'all, and if it's not, it won't hurt my feelings at all. I was planning on doing something on chapter 5 next Sunday, and then it seemed kind of weird to do 1 John without doing something with 2nd and 3rd John. So I thought what I would do is one Sunday on 2nd John, one Sunday on 3rd John, if that's okay with y'all.
And we may have to make decision about the drive-in church Sunday 2 weeks from now, because that's at 10 o'clock. And so think about that. We'll discuss, but we're going to have to figure out what we're going to do about class on that week.
All right.
Maybe 8:30 that Sunday.
Well, some of us may have other obligations that it may be crazy. So we'll discuss next week, but think about it and we'll